Hello everybody, my name is Eva Meijer and I will speak to you about animals and language today because many human beings think that other animals do not speak, but this is not true and it's also not a coincidence, it's not a neutral position. It follows from the hierarchy between humans and other animals in society. But before we get to that, I want to tell you something about the prairie dogs. Prairie dogs are a species of ground squirrel. They live in tunnels underneath the ground and do not leave their village, usually. It's like human beings who live in a small town and always stay there for the whole of their lives. And this makes it very easy for predators to come and catch them because the prairie dogs always need to come up to eat. So the predators can just lie and wait near the end of the tunnels. And these prairie dogs therefore developed a very complex system of alarm calls. Alarm calls are calls that non-human animals use to tell each other that something's wrong, that somebody's approaching, somebody wants to attack them. These prairie dogs have different sounds or calls or words for different predators. They, for example, tell each other if a predator is coming from the sky or if they are coming from the ground. And this is, of course, important because you need to know this in order to know how to escape the situation. Are you going to go back into your tunnel or do you hide somewhere else? But their messages do not end with that information. In fact, they usually describe intruders in detail. So when a human being approaches their territory, they tell each other, look, there's a human approaching. But they also tell each other with which speed they are approaching. Oh, they're very fast or they're very slow. They tell each other about the height of the human, the color of their hair, the color of their t-shirt, and even if they are carrying something with them, like a bag or an umbrella or a gun. There was a study in which a human was shooting a gun into the sky, and they also remembered afterwards that this human was somehow scary. So they told each other, oh, look, there's a human who had the gun with him a while back. It's the same for other animals. So when a dog approaches or a coyote, they tell each other about what kind of dog it is. If it's a familiar dog, they will describe that as well because usually because they have their fixed territories, other animals and predators also do that. So when there are coyotes, they will tell each other, oh, it's Jim or it's Mary. And they describe these animals also in detail. Now, the language of the prairie dogs sort of functions like a human language. It has a grammar, so the meaning of the sounds changes when their order changes. And that's the same in human language. They use verbs, nouns, adverbs, and they can combine these also to make new words and new expressions. There was a study in which there was an oval new object coming from the sky, and they told each other, look, there's an oval unknown object coming from the sky. These prairie dogs do not just use alarm calls, they also have a form of social chatter, and we do not know much about that yet. They also do a sort of wave, which is called the jump yip, so they jump up and they say yip, and then everybody does that. It's an expression of joy. For example, when a snake leaves their territory, they do this. Now, these prairie dogs, the language of the prairie dogs may seem very exceptional, but prairie dogs are not unique in their language use. What is unique is that their language has been studied in so much detail. There's a biologist called Kon Slobodchikov, and he studied them for over 25 years. For most other animals, this is not the case. There's not a lot of information about languages of other animals. I will tell you why in a little while. But the information that there is shows that there's actually a lot to it. So for most animals, we know one or two things. But this shows us that human language is not unique. An example is names. many human beings think that humans are the only ones who use names, the only ones who, the only animals who name their children. But many other animals do. Dolphins, for example, use names. These are called signature whistles. Parrots give their children names. Bats have names. Bats argue a lot, and apparently they also really like to gossip. So when they argue with another bat and this bat flies away, you can hear the bats talking about this bat for a very long time. I just said something about grammar in the language of prairie dogs. And you find grammatical structures in the languages of many animals. This has been studied in the languages of birds, but also whales. Whales have complex languages that we do not know a lot about yet. But it's not simply sound. So when you think about animals and language, there are many ways in which animals express themselves. This may involve sound, but also gestures, as I'm using my hand, making eye contact. Scent. Humans can't study this very well because we can't smell as well as the other animals do. But also color. So the language of Caribbean reef squid can also is a language in color. So they have these squid have complex changing color patterns at the sides of their bodies. And researchers didn't know what to make of that because it's simply a kind of code in color. And then somebody thought about studying this as a language, and it turns out that these color patterns are indeed like a language with a structure, grammatical rules. And these squid can also talk to people at the same time. So they may speak to someone they like on one side of their body, and when somebody else is approaching on the other side, they may tell them to back off. So it's also not the case that human language is automatically more complex or interesting than the languages of these other animals. Scent is also a good example. Many insects use scent to communicate. These scents may have a grammar, a structure, depending on how different components, different chemical components relate. Precisely. And this is also something that we know very little about because, as I just said, for the languages of many animals, there's more that we do not know than that we do know. What is important to mention also is that there's a lot of communication possible between humans and other animals. So languages are species specific. You are, when you express yourself, you're tied to the fact that you have a certain kind of body, that you can fly or swim or jump very high or hide very well, camouflage yourself with your skin. But there are also languages also social, of course. And specifically with species of animals that humans have been together with for a very long time, like dogs, but also cows, horses, chickens, cats, and others, you find that there's a lot of complex communication possible, sometimes involving words, for example, between humans and dogs. Dogs understand human grammar. There are dogs who show that they understand the meaning of over 1,000 words. But also on the chemical level. So again, using the example of dogs, there are studies that show that when a human and a dog who love each other gaze into each other's eyes, they both create oxytocin, and oxytocin is known as the cuddle hormone. This is something that humans produce when they look into the eyes of a loved one or a baby, and this also happens between dogs and humans. I would not be surprised if it's also true for humans and other companion animals, but I don't know of research into that. But that's a very sort of deep form of communication, both in the case of humans and also in the interspecies case. But there are many more examples also of horses who can interpret human moods from photographs and then remember that when they meet the human being later. And these studies are not simply interesting. They are not simply a sort of funny knowledge and, look, this animal can do that and that animal can do that. Wonderful, now I move on with my day. No, they are they very basically challenge some of the assumptions of what it is to be a human being, because in the history of philosophy, language was very often connected with thinking and building a community. And now it turns out that humans are not the only ones who do that. So this has effects for how we understand our position as humans in the world and our relations with the other animals. And also language. It also invites us to think about language in other ways. As we all know, in many knowledge systems, I live in the Netherlands, over here it's completely assumed that other animals do not speak, that they are silent, that they are destined to stay mute in political and social matters. And this is reflected in our political and legal practices. So human beings are seen as subjects, beings worthy of rights and dignity, and humans have a certain moral standing, and other animals are considered to be objects, even though there's an increasing recognition of animal sentience, of seeing them as beings with feelings and the subjective experience of their lives. Still, legally and politically, they are seen as mute. And there's a very close connection in the case of humans, but also in relation to other animals, between speaking and being seen as a political actor. And this also shows that the question of who speaks is not simply an empirical question, but it's a political question. So when we think about animals and language, this is political in many different ways. On the one hand, animals have been silenced for a very long time, so they are portrayed as mute, and this benefits humans because humans benefit from using other animals. But on the other hand, the fact that animals speak, that they exercise agency, that they are subjective, that they are beings who have a first-person experience of their own lives, also has political weight, because it's a very fundamental democratic insight in the case of humans that you are not simply the recipient of rules, of laws, of political rights, but that when you are part of a democratic community, you should also have the right to influence the rules under which you live. And that is connected to political voice and to democratic agency. And as we saw, animals have been silenced, but they do speak, and acknowledging that actually opens up the way for creating new communities together with these other animals. And this last point is not simply important for doing justice to animal subjectivity, to recognizing that they are beings who have a life that's important to them, that they are social beings, that they very often have cultures that matter to them. Families, friends, and so on. But it's also important for humans, because many of the problems that human beings are facing worldwide have to do with human exceptionalism. So specifically in Europe, where I live, but also in other parts of the world, humans saw themselves as the center of the world, as the beginning and the end of everything. And this led to an attitude towards other animals, but also natural resources, the earth itself, ecosystems, forests, the sea, of exploitation. Because when you are the only subject, when you are the only thinking being, the only speaking being, it's very easy to exploit and use the rest of the world for your own purposes. And what we find now in the context of climate change and ecological collapse is that this attitude is beginning to bite us in the tail. So we need to change, and I think that turning towards other animals should be the starting point of that change for their sake, but also for the sake of a decent human future for ourselves and others. I will get to that later. First, I need to take a closer look at the interconnections between language and politics. I already told you that I'm a philosopher, and in political philosophy, the ability to speak is usually considered to be a necessary condition for being a political actor and for membership of the political community. Speaking is seen as a human enterprise, something that humans only do, and as clearly distinct from how other animals express themselves. And this view has very long roots in the history of Western philosophy. So Aristotle already defined man, and for him man was actually man, so a very specific class of humans, male free humans. But he defined man as the only true political animal. And he connected this to logos, the ability for rational speech, for a speech in which you can make a distinction between right and wrong. And being a political animal was also connected to membership of the political community. So what Aristotle does is he basically makes three distinctions between humans and other animals, between language and sound, and language is then a human capacity, and he draws a border around those who are part of the political community, who can decide about our collective futures, and those who are not. And the last thing that is important to note here is that he does this in human language. So it's also already a certain prejudice is already apparent in that. What we find is that under influence of these studies that I discussed before about animal language, there are similar studies in the field of animal cultures, animal cognition, animal emotion, animal mourning, the way they deal with death. All kinds of capacities are suddenly being researched in very serious ways. And political philosophy is picking up on that. So animal philosophers used to work in ethics, in which its questions are very much about how we as humans should treat the other animals. But now there's a political turn in animal philosophy, and you find that these animal philosophers are thinking about animals and the political community, relationships between groups of non-human animals and human political communities. And this is a very interesting new field, because many of the questions that we are dealing with, those who are thinking about animals, are political in some sense. I already spoke about legal participation, about institutions, about political voice, membership of the multi-species political community. And for all of these things, we it's true that we thought about this for a very long time in relation to humans, so how different communities of humans relate to each other, and this can function as a starting point for thinking about animals and politics. However, what we find is that in these different subfields of political animal philosophy, there's very little attention for animal voice and animal language. And this is because many people simply think that other animals do not speak, or that it's impossible to gain access to their minds while they are speaking all along. Actually, they're speaking all the time, also about us, right? So there are chickens who name their humans. When chickens live with different humans, they give them names. But many animals who are frightened of humans will also name them. Elephants have a word for human that signals danger. So they use this when the humans are approaching and when they are scared. And this is also, you saw that in the alarm calls as well from the prairie dogs, they can be quite precise. So the animals talk about us all the time. They have to, because they need to deal with humans in their lives. So how do we move on? How can we take this new knowledge of animals, and it's not new, I mean, other in indigenous traditions, but also in every tradition there have been counter voices, humans who did take animals seriously, did take their voices seriously, but collectively as societies we've not yet done that. So how to move forward? Well, one of the things that humans like to do is to do more research, but the problem with that is that research very often reinforces stereotypical views that already exist in society. And in fact, animal language research is a very good example of this. Because for a very long time, human language was seen as the only language, and other animals were studied on the basis, their capacities for language were studied on the basis of how well they could speak in human language. So in the early 20th century, there was quite a lot of research done with chimpanzees, parrots, dolphins, all kinds of animals, and researchers try to make them speak in human words. But for many animals, that's very difficult. For example, for a dolphin, it's very difficult to speak and pronounce human words. And they tried, and for example, certain chimpanzees were very good in sign language, and this taught us some things about the way in which they can learn a second language, because it's a second language for them. And also about how well they are attuned to animals of other species, but it doesn't tell us a whole lot about their languages. And you see that in other situations as well. Human prejudice very often influences the research questions, and research questions always set the framework within which other animals can answer. Vincent Desprez wrote a book called What Would Animals Say If We Asked the Right Questions? And the title of this book already shows us how important it is that we ask open questions and let animals influence the content of the research. And our societies are still anthropocentric in nature. So we still live in these hierarchical systems in which humans are seen as better than other animals, and the standard to which other animals should be measured. And this is very problematic. So there are already people doing other kinds of research. Barbara Smuts, for example, wrote a really beautiful paper, Encounters with Animal Minds, in which she describes how she learns to live with a group of baboons, how she comes to be accepted by them. And this involves her learning to speak baboon, because if you are baboons are social animals, and if you ignore them, they will understand this as a social act, and they will be insulted, and it will be very difficult to have good relationships with them. There are more examples. Len Howard, who lived with wild songbirds in the 1950s in England, and wrote 2 books about that, Birds as Individuals and Living with Birds, is also a good example of a researcher who aimed to study other animals on the basis of trust and freedom, and who understood that her own positionality, her own situatedness as a researcher also played a role in this society. So research can help, but what is more important is that we also develop political ways forward. And one of these ways is very familiar in animal rights thinking, and this is that we need to extend existing institutions, laws, and political practices to incorporate animal interests, but also their perspectives, because as we saw, they also have a perspective on the shared society. This has received many attention already, so I will not linger on that very long, but I do want to note that very often rights are seen as the end point, so we need to strive for animal rights and then we have an equal society. But I think it's the other way around. Rights can be a starting point for new conversations and new interactions with other animals, and should be understood as flexible tools for moving forward, moving to a more just society, but not as an end point. The second point is that we need to create new political rituals and practices. And you already find different initiatives. I think the research that I just discussed of Barbara Smuts and Glenn Howard also falls into this category. But there's also research in animal sanctuaries. So these are places where formerly exploited animals can live out their lives. For example, in farmed animal sanctuaries, those who escaped from slaughter or were rescued by humans can get a second chance and make something of their lives. And again, sometimes these sanctuaries are seen as end stations where animals live who are rescued, but instead you can also view them as new places where new beginnings can be formed, as political communities. And there are already certain sanctuaries, like Vine Sanctuary in Vermont, where the other animals are seen as co-residents that are not only living there, but should also have a voice in how the community is organized. And this involves asking questions about co-government, about the daily practices, habits, and routines, and paying attention to their agency and their perspective on life. But there are many more examples, and you also find many cases in which humans and other animals already interact, for example, in conflict. Here in the Netherlands, there's a conflict with wild geese. Geese and humans struggle because they want to have the same territories. And understanding them as political animals, as political actors, understanding these conflicts as political can help create new solutions to these problems. So this very often involves humans taking a step back and perhaps developing new ways of interacting with each other, deliberating, not simply with physical interactions, but material interactions in the landscape can also play a role. So for example, with the geese, you can make the landscape more attractive or less attractive. It's not so complex. And we actually already know quite a lot about this because humans have lived with these animals for a very long time. But this is situated, this differs from place to place. So developing new political rituals, new political habits, new forms of government, new shared communities can guide the way to a more just future, because as humans there's so much we don't know yet about animals, so we can't figure out the future. I can't give you a full set of rules that you can follow and then we'll live in a perfect multi-species community. This is really a process of question and response, and the voices of the animals should be central. And this means that humans need to learn to listen. We also don't listen to each other. We don't listen to other humans. Our societies, politics, cultures are very focused on talking, on self-expression, on monologues, on this kind of argumentative struggle with words. And the only way to move beyond that is by listening. And as I already said, this is of utmost importance for the other animals who are struggling so much because of what humans do to them. Many of them are suffering. Most of them we can't save, but we have to try. But it also matters for our own future and for our collective future, because if we continue to live like this, we will simply lose everything. So we need to change, and we are very fortunate to have the other animals to show us the way. Thank you.